You're good?
Testing, testing. Yes. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me. It is an honor to be here. Thank you very much. So many disclaimers I need to put out there from the beginning. Firstly, sort of a bait and switch here, but a good one, an honest one, if that's not too much of an oxymoron. In delving into this, which is very much an ongoing project, I realized there is such a plethora of content to cover. So, and another disclosure, I will be giving some variation of this talk or an expansion or modification of this talk at multiple speaking venues over the next several weeks and months. So I wanted to give you all something slightly more original. So the actual title we're gonna move forward with is a focus on topographic mapping products in particular. So I kind of twisted the title around. We're going to be calling this Mapping the Grand Canyon in Pursuit of a Larger Scale Topographic Foundation. I promise it will live up to its glory. Let me make sure that I cover all my disclaimers. Another disclaimer. Yes, I have the very fantastic privilege and honor of a fantastic title. I am the Director of Maps, Imagery and Geospatial Services at ASU Library, which is effectively a job where I get to play with maps all day. What does that mean? Well, it means I know a decent bit about maps and geographic information systems and geospatial technologies, et cetera, and traditional modes of cartography and various other fields of study that invariably involve mapping and history and geography, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm no geologist. I am no karst hydrologist. I've only been in Arizona for 2.5 years. I first came to the Grand Canyon in 2016. I did my first rim to rim just last year in May when the North Rim opened up, just like right at the beginning of the season in mid-May. So yeah, I think that's enough with the disclaimers. Let's get on with it because there's plenty of content here. We're going to start off with a story which is really the underlying theme of this entire presentation, which is a perennial ongoing theme that really kind of embodies the entire pursuit of human cartography, which is the quest for a better base map. And we're going to start with this one base map in particular, a map that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, maybe vaguely, maybe very intimately. It is the July 1978 National Geographic Magazine edition of The Heart of the Grand Canyon. It is a cartographically celebrated map, cartographically celebrated for many reasons, both scientific and aesthetic, artistic, and we'll get into some of those in a moment. But it is indeed an aesthetically gorgeous map. And the reason some of you may be familiar, you may think, man, I've seen that map before, is because it's listed in at least one location at a place where many of you probably traffic frequently, which is the Phantom Ranch Cantina, right? Also, it is in at least one other location in a rim-to-rim trail on Bright Angel in, Indian Springs at the National Park Service Ranger Outpost. I'm probably butchering the name of that particular facility, but another version of this identical map is there. So you're probably more familiar with it than you actually realize. So there it is on the wall in the cantina, and not coincidentally, or perhaps coincidentally, right when I took that picture, some other visitors were actually looking at that same map. So this is a very iconic, as I said, cartographically celebrated bit of map making. And the person behind this initiative was none other than Bradford Washburn. Some of you may know him. He's kind of a legendary explorer, a mountaineer photographer. He was the founder and director of the Boston Science Library, and he led the half-decade topographic survey in the 1970s, from 1971 to 1975, that ultimately culminated with that July 1978 National Geographic publication of The Heart of the Grand Canyon. Now, he thoroughly documented this research study in a National Geographic research report because the National Geographic Society was one of the primary benefactors, one of the primary sponsors of this half-decade survey into the so-called Heart of the Grand Canyon, the portion of the Grand Canyon that most of us are most intimately familiar with. And he did a very thorough kind of methodological and survey explanation of how the topographic survey was undertaken. And forgive the very long quote, I'm going to kind of paraphrase here, but it's a fantastic quote to kind of set the premise here. When my wife and I visited the Grand Canyon in fall of 1969, mind you, this is I'm getting my dates wrong. This is nearly 100 years after John Wesley Powell's famous 1869 initial exploration of the Colorado River. So when my wife and I visited the Grand Canyon in fall of 1969, we were disturbed by the fact that no large-scale maps of the area existed for either the hiker, very relevant here, or the scientist who has any desire or need to know precisely where he or she is going, or indeed precisely where he is going. A map with the scale of an inch to a mile, which for the technical map geeks is 1 to 62,500, is simply inadequate. Here's another map geek note. That's about 15 minutes of latitude by 15 minutes of longitude. It's simply inadequate to depict such, as we all know very intimately, incredibly rough country with extremely intricate trails involving hundreds of tight switchbacks. I don't need to go on. I think you get it. This is also far too small a scale for the accurate plotting of the geology, botany, or archaeology of the heavily frequented and much studied heart of the Grand Canyon. One of the people who presented earlier, just a couple presentations before me, spoke about LiDAR data, right? Light detection and ranging data. So these are extremely highly dense point clouds that could be processed and create extremely high resolution terrain surfaces. So when we think about that now, and we take this extremely high resolution data for granted, we forget that it's that high resolution data on which actual scientific pursuits like geology, botany, archaeology, hydrology, sophisticated hydrological analyses are actually predicated, right? We need proper data to make this happen. So often we look at a map and we're like, wow, like big deal, it's a map, but very rarely do we realize the legacy and the work and the methodology and the science and the aesthetics, so many layers, figurative layers and literal layers that go into map making. Okay, let's reference those maps that Bradford Washburn was bemoaning just about 40 years ago. So we have the Bright Angel Quadrangle, and this is a scale of 1 to 48, so 1 unit on the ground is equivalent to 48,000 units in the real world. Contour intervals, these are two basic metrics by which topographic maps are characterized, 50 feet each. And kind of put this aside, shelve this little factoid for later in our presentation, but that data right there was collected right at the beginning of the 20th century by Francois-Emile Mat, a fantastic Dutch-born cartographer who maps, I'll tell you more about him later, but who maps some of the most remote areas of the United States that ultimately became national parks, including Yosemite, Grand Canyon, et cetera, et cetera. So that was the topographic base data that was collected in 1902 and 1903. And moving forward about 50 or 60 years, that's when we had the first kind of qualitative, meaningful improvement in the topographic accuracy of the base map, right? So 60 years later, we do make nominal improvements to it, although the scale is slightly smaller from the 1 to 48,000 to the 1 to 62,500, and the contours are slightly wider. At least this map data was collected not by in situ or on-site field-based techniques, but through photogrammetric methods from aerial photography. So the fundamental technology, the acquisition method, was very different 60 years later. But still, from 1902, 1903, for that entire more than half century, the topographic map data stayed pretty static. So moving forward, we're looking at this data and getting back to Bradford Washburn's bemoaning of these maps. Indeed, the tight, intricate trails can't be depicted on this relatively coarse topographic base map. So again, this is really the justification for the perpetual improvement, trying to get more resolution, get more scale out of our raw topographic base data. So Bradford Washburn, being the type of guy he is, with his fantastic wife Barbara, who accompanied him on some of his most epic journeys, including summiting Mount Denali, he'd set out to make a better base map. He got funds from the Boston Science Museum, from the National Geographic, and he did indeed go out to conduct that survey. Now, that's epic. That's fantastic. And, he's not, at the prime of his youth. This is a man who's at least 60 years old, and he's still rocking it. Now, I do not mean this in any disparaging way, because this guy's a rock star. But the methods by which he was able to conduct the study were fundamentally different than those that Francois-Emile Mat had in the early 20th century, in 1902, 1903. So still we see the same fundamental type of equipment. We see a tripod, we see a theodolite, and he used other equipment like a laser rangefinder, effectively to construct triangles, right? I'm sure there's some surveyors in here who could probably correct my lack of jargon or whatnot, but essentially we're dealing with the same trigonomic mathematical principles. Constructing a control network of triangles, right? Trilateration. And obviously, every survey was effectively using the state-of-the-art, the best available equipment and technology of the day. And Bradford Washburn not only had the benefit of dealing with or having at his disposal kind of mid-20th century, 1970s equipment, but he also had the benefit of aerial photography, right? So unlike the predecessors, the topographic shoulders on which his work rested, he had the benefit of aerial photography, remote sensing, right? Not having to be on site to collect your data, and thus expanding to photogrammetry, which is a fancy way to say doing surveys in a lab, measuring distances and angles based on photography, right? Photogrammetry. So the Bradford-Washburn survey was a combination of both field-based methods and remote sensing methods. The actual field-based portion of the study was 5 years in the 1970s, as I discussed. But then the whole second part, or rather, one of the multiple subsequent stages of this topographic kind of cartographic construction process continued far beyond the fieldwork process. So, the photogrammetrists are at work actually scribing into effectively transparent mylar sheets the raw topographic base data, as well as the hydrographic data. So fieldwork consisted of theodolite and laser range-finding equipment. Here's the rub. Over 700 helicopter landings were made over a total of 12 field visits over the course of half a decade. Not disparaging Washburn or his fantastic wife Barbara at all, but he had some significant advantages over his predecessors. It took half a decade, like I said, combined fieldwork and remote sensing, low-altitude aerial photography with photogrammetry, and the output, as I just mentioned, were the raw topographic and hydrographic base data, generated at a scale far larger than anything heretofore. So we're talking about 1 to 4,800. That is not a typo. 1 to 4,800. Extremely, extremely detailed, large-scale data. And this is what those raw data look like. We actually happened to have them at ASU. There's a fantastic story behind this. I can't get into it now, but they are technically property of National Geographic. We ultimately sent them back to their rightful home at the National Geographic Society Museum in Washington, D.C. So, and I have to speak fast. I know I might be dizzying right now, but there's a lot of stuff to cover. This is the intro, by the way. This is the prologue. Believe it or not. So those raw data were 1 to 4,800. Not a typo, extremely large-scale products. They were ultimately coalesced to create that cartographically celebrated 1 to 24,000, a reduction in scale, a reduction in the detail, but still a doubling of detail compared to the 1 to 48,000 that were previously available through the Francois-Emile Mott surveys. So again, just highlighting some of this metadata here. Map geeks might appreciate that. Moving on, I'm really emphasizing scale here because that's really one of the cruxes of this whole quest for a better topographic base map. But we must read the details too. Again, I just want to emphasize this. It wasn't just Bradford Washburn and his wife. It was also a network of contracted aerial photography companies. They also had contracted with the the Topographical Survey of Switzerland to really do some of the most fantastic hatcher work and three-dimensional representation of relief, of topography. So my point with this slide is that a lot of people were involved, and it was a multi-year, half-decade undertaking. So we look at this map, and it's well-known, cartographically celebrated, but it's really and this is really the point I want to drive home, Bradford Washburn stood on the topographic shoulders of giants, those who preceded him. And I want to mention some of these giants, and there's just a few. The problem with taking on such an ambitious project is that you invariably omit dozens, if not hundreds of people who either were never contained in history books, or their roles were so marginal, or there was some sort of political thing. But I'm going to point out some key figures that I think all of you, as kind of hikers and curators of the trail, should know about. So Francois-Emile Mott, really one of my kind of personal geek heroes, an explorer, geologist, topographer, really kind of a world-renowned climatologist before climate science was a real thing, or a widely acknowledged and scientifically accepted field. And he developed that expertise by studying glaciers. But his real claim to fame is, at least in the context of the Grand Canyon, was that Mott conducted the first systematic survey, yielding the most significant improvements in topographic accuracy. And it was actually more than a 25-year effort. Mind you, this is from 1902, and actually through multiple historical kind of artifacts or kind of extenuating circumstances, it had to be extended, one of which, of course, is World War I, etc. Moving on, Joseph Christmas Ives. I'm going to talk about him and his comrade, Frederick Wilhelm von Eglofstein. So I'm just kind of highlighting the key figures here, and of course we all know the most famous of the early canyon observers and expedition leaders, John Wesley Powell. And I highlight here that I'm highlighting expedition leaders. Again, there are so many people who aren't contained in here that rightfully should be. I'm already going to be pressed for time, so I'm sure you understand. And of course, I need not really elaborate much on Powell. I'm sure most of you know his claim to fame. Among other things, he led the first ever geoscientific expedition through the entirety of the Colorado River. Of course, the first documented, unless you want to get into debates about John White and his supposed exploration or kind of a fleeing of natives who were trying to kill him, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, the first documented Anglo-American exploration with a scientific pursuit, an explicitly scientific motivation to explore the Colorado River and its canyons. So before we get into the specifics of their contributions, let's talk about what maps actually existed in the pre-Civil War, the antebellum, and during the wartime period in Grand Canyon cartography. One of the most fantastic maps I think you should all also take note of. It's not a very well-known map, but it's the Ferris map. It's the map of the Northwest Fur Country that was probably drawn in 1835 or 1836, not published for more than a century later. Right? So it was contained in his collection of memoirs, a kind of a personal narrative or journal, Life in the Rocky Mountains, Life in the Rocky Mountains, a diary of wanderings on the sources of the rivers, Missouri, Columbia, and Colorado, etc. So this is what the map looked like by our modern standards. Extremely crude. Take a photo if you're going to take it. Don't worry, I'm about to zoom in. Here we go. This is the really interesting part here. Right there you see these two very kind of unpassable barriers. You know, it's like Gandalf should be there with his staff, thou shalt not pass. And right here you see that text right there, and you can see it right there. Let me highlight it for you. Great Canyon of the Colorado. So this is perhaps, the significance of this Ferris map is that it may be the first explicit reference to the Grand Canyon ever. Ever. Speculative, still needs to be determined, but from my preliminary research, this, in fact, it suggests that it is indeed the first explicit reference to the Grand Canyon. So moving forward, we have Iglufstein. So Iglufstein was that baron. I'm sure he's also very well known to many of you. He accompanied the Joseph Christmas Ives expedition in 1857, 1858. It started off with a steamboat expedition from the mouth of the Colorado River until it was no longer deemed navigable. They got off, started an overland trek, and his map is fantastic. Now, mind you, take note of these dates. Drawn in 57, 58. Published in a report in 1861. Of course, we have the incipient American Civil War, so not much attention was given to this fantastically gorgeous map, and probably the most meaningful improvement of a depiction of what we now knowingly and intimately know as the Grand Canyon. But it was effectively neglected. Here's a zoom-in version of that. And well, here's the kind of metadata for it, but mind you, this is far before the USGS. Cartographic explorations were funded by the War Department. Joseph Christmas Ives led the expedition, but drawn, and I really want to highlight this gentleman's contribution because he really was a cartographic innovator. And take note of the scale here. Again, that denominator, the bottom number, the bigger it is, the less detail. So we're talking about 1 unit on the map refers to more than 500,000, 760,000, excuse me. Really, really coarse, but still a significant improvement from that very coarse Ferris map from which was, of course, unbeknownst to these people whatsoever because it wasn't published until 1940. But let's take a look at this. I mean, you see here, Big Canyon of the Colorado. You look at there, and look, this is entirely speculated. The true course of the Colorado River was not known, but it's so gorgeously done when you really appreciate it. I'll go back just for a second. The actual source of the Colorado River is kind of just dissolves, It's just, make it up. But it's so gorgeous here, and you would think, wow, the Colorado River is actually a giant lake right there in its kind of center point. Moving on, and of course, Newberry, Dr. Newberry, the geologist on board who made major contributions to the botany, et cetera, of the Grand Canyon. This may be the very first geologic map of the Grand Canyon. Any geologist in the room will probably acknowledge how effectively useless it is because it's so coarse, both in its categorical resolution, how detailed these geologic classifications are, but also in the lack of spatial detail in those classifications. Here's another fantastic one, and anyone holding up signs, please hold them up prominently if I'm soaking up too much time. But this fantastic map from 1858, and mind you, this is contemporaneous to, this is concurrent to the expedition of Joseph Christmas Ives, right? Pre-Civil War, 1858, but it explicitly mentions the Joseph Christmas Ives. So this is a map basically of the entire Western continent. This is the era of United States Manifest Destiny. The United States has recently acquired this entire swath of land from Mexico, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And we see here a really interesting depiction of the Grand Canyon. Here's more metadata for you, but let me move on to it. And here we see and you see very faintly the course of Lieutenant Ives' overland journey, but here, I guess they exercised a little bit more artistic license and said, maybe the Colorado River connects right there. Let's just, throw it in. But a very different aesthetic representational approach to the many sub-canyons, right? Because the Grand Canyon really is almost like fractal-like. It's really a whole of canyons greater than the sum of its individual constituent parts. So looking at that detail, a lot of artistic license taken here. It's really gorgeous. Again, I get to play with maps. I get to look at this stuff. Pretty sweet gig. All right. And there are so many maps. I'm inadvertently, trust me, omitting dozens, if not hundreds. But here's another official map of the territory of Arizona. Again, Arizona achieving statehood in 1912. So this is a full, 60 some odd years before. And I can just ask you all to close your eyes, and we can imagine that map of pre-statehood Arizona in 1865. I'm sure our tech guys are going to save me in just a second. What's that? Yes, exactly. This is exactly what it looked like at night before all the light pollution came, and thank you so much. Yes, so resuming that 1865 official map of the territory of Arizona, I just want to show you some interesting tidbits here. So again, Joseph Christmas Ives has already been in there, 1858. John Wesley Powell is not going to enter the Grand Canyon for another 4 years in 1869. But here we still see unexplored. We see some references to Paiute Indians. And there's so many fascinating little kind of written notes cartographic indications about various features. But still, fundamentally, not very insightful, frankly, if you're leading expeditions or if you're a fur trapper, if you're a frontiers person, etc. Hartley's map of Arizona, a private map, again, just 2 years before John Wesley Powell. Let's see what this one looked like. Again, kind of disregarding, knowing that the Joseph Christmas Ives / Eglestein map is effectively guesswork, they basically continued it, or they were completely oblivious to it and did their own guesswork. A very different type of representation. But again, a lot of artistic license being played here. And again, interesting notes. And we see here this one, no big, no grand, no great, just canyon of the Colorado. Old Territory and Military Department of New Mexico, again, 1867. Let's take a look at this guy. Interesting, this is kind of a whole view. Let's zoom in. What do we have here? And I want to take note, the original, and this goes into lithography and the nature of map printing. They basically make their template, and they don't want to make too many modifications. So the raw base map is effectively 59, but they added some stuff about a decade later, a little bit, 8 years later. And let's see what we have here. Again, Big Canyon of the Colorado, all guesswork. Really nothing there. But don't get me mistaken. Of course, there's still communities, there's still settlements, there's still indigenous people, there's still communities of plants, communities of animals, and there is very much an act of effective erasure happening here. Not necessarily with some sort of, at this stage, perhaps not a deliberate colonial imperialist desire to erase populations, but it is an East Coast-centric, Washington, D.C. based perspective of these newly acquired Western lands. How does this newly consolidated country learn about itself, gain self-awareness? Now, I want to talk briefly about this great blank space here. In this map, territory of the United States from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean. Concurrent to, or just a year before, so John Wesley Powell and his crew and his students are in the Colorado, in the Rockies, probably starting to plan for the famous expiration, the initial 1869 expiration. Let's take a look at what this map looks like. And this map's really important because for the first time, although it has the same title of a previous map I showed you, the territory of the United States from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean, take note of the scale, very coarse. But again, this is a continental kind of nation-based map, so the scale's not a culprit here, nothing wrong with that. But this map is an official government map, and at the time, the official government topographers and map makers decided to exclude any data that was not authoritatively, reliably known. So here we have an explicit blank space. And this is really telling because mapping the Grand Canyon is not just mapping this fantastic chasm in northwest Arizona. In the history of cartography, the mapping of the Grand Canyon actually marked the beginning of a new continental manifest destiny, westward identity, and kind of filling in one of the last remaining blank spaces on the map. And in this era of manifest destiny, filling in that space is a political economic imperative, right? Knowing your own territory. How can the vast resources and how can this newly consolidated country make good and exploit the resources of its country? So of course, in enters one of our main protagonists, John Wesley Powell, very iconic photos. That's about his appearance when he embarked on his initial 1869 exploration. Of course, it's well known. He's perhaps that leads to some of his legendary status. He's a one-armed Civil War veteran. He lost it to a musket ball, which actually, I'm sure that's why we all probably hold a little bit of more respect for this very vigilant man who effectively was a self-taught geologist and went on to do amazing things. So we've seen these iconic photos, the first expedition, pretty poorly planned. We're talking about mapping the Grand Canyon with barometers, right, to determine elevation, to determine altitude based on the air pressure. We're talking about using sectants to do relatively crude measurements that were surprisingly accurate of longitude and latitude to determine basically astronomical measurements of latitude and longitude. Really fascinatingly, these days, folks like me and others who can just easily pop in data to a geographic information system, we admittedly fail to understand some of the deeper mathematical principles behind this. We take these accomplishments for granted, and we really shouldn't. And I hope if there's any takeaway with all this is that you all maybe have a deeper understanding and appreciation for what goes into this, especially in the middle of the 19th century in terra incognita. So, fantastic extracts from his famous publication, originally published in Scribner's Magazine, and ultimately a well-known best-selling book that we can all get at any gift store, Explorations of the Canyons of the Colorado River, etc. And this was the map published in 1875 in Scribner's Monthly, the last edition, where it was actually John Wesley Powell's first map of, and it wasn't actually produced by him, but first map of the Greater Grand Canyon region. The significance of this map is that it was the first time that it correctly, plus or minus a couple miles or a few miles, corrected the course of the Colorado River. No more random lake in the middle of that. So, a man that I'm sure we can all admire. Again, another long quote, but it's worthy, I hope. In 1874, he testified before a U.S. House committee. The work has been completed. You have on the wall one of the preliminary maps of the region. It is but a tracing of the field sketches. The computations for latitude, longitude, and altitudes are not yet completed, nor have the triangles been computed, so that it is not a final map. There is now left within the territory of the United States no great unexplored region, and exploring expeditions are no longer needed for general purposes. Now, there are a slew of political purposes. There was effectively a race for getting government support to fund continued explorations, but it's a pretty bold statement, although others who were effectively competing with Powell at the time made similar statements. I can't delve into the multitude of legacies, of cartographic legacies on which this sort of work was built, but take it as another takeaway that virtually any other esoteric or mainstream scientific mapping application, from geology to karst hydrology to to cultural resources or archaeological or paleontological science, depends, it's very easy to digest, on a fundamentally accurate and detailed topographic base map. And of course, I'm referencing this image that was part of the 1882 Clarence Dutton Tertiary History of the Grand Canyon, which included some of the best, or some of the earliest substantive geologic maps ever. Again, I won't delve into them because we have to focus here on something that I thought would be of most interest to all of you, the topographic mapping effort. I need to speak briefly about Francois-Emile Mat. I've mentioned him several times throughout the presentation, but again, I must give him his due credit because his work, unlike that of John Wesley Powell, or unlike that of Claude Hale Birdseye, who did his own mapping of the Colorado River in 1923, Francois-Emile Mat and his colleague Evans did this from a completely overland route. Now, we're talking about before any of the trails existed. You had John Hand's trail that was very primitive, very rough, not used for pack animals, and of course they needed pack animals. I'm acting like I was part of the expedition. But they needed pack animals to move their equipment. So we're talking about the first systematic, methodologically systematic, meaning the most complex and effectively, in terms of statistics 101, the greatest sample size of control points. We're talking about plane table mapping, and the outcome is absolutely gorgeous. It resulted in the 1 to 48,000 scale map that was effectively the only proper topographic data that existed until aerial remote sensing methods were introduced in the 1960s or mid-1950s. Okay, I have 2 minutes, so let's get to the gist of all this. What's the point? So, of course, it's gorgeous. I want you to take a mental snapshot of Isis Temple here, because I'm going to show you a bunch of Isis temples in a moment. Isis, of course, the Egyptian god Isis, not the terrorist organization that's trying to build a caliphate. And we all know that, of course. You know this better than I. So, of course, this produced, the 1 to 48,000 Mott survey produced effectively one of the best Grand Canyon National Park maps ever published. This was published, I'm getting my years wrong, I think this was in 48, believe it or not. Of course, there were maps that preceded this. This is one of the few references to geologic mapping I will make, just to make the side note that this was a 1962 John Maxon map, and I don't have the zoom in on it, but it's basically taken the raw Francois-Emile Mat topography and overlaying, arduous, rigorous geologic surveys upon that. But again, the takeaway, you can't do anything else until you know where things are with proper topographic accuracy and detail. Moving on, there's another mental snapshot of Isis Temple, but again, building on the Francois-Emile Mat 1902, 1903, all the way to 1926 survey. And of course, we had other maps of the national park, gorgeous, and very, here the cartographers, I don't know who this is directly attributable to. It is produced by the National Park Service, but one of the first national park maps in 1926, of course, we're celebrating the centennial. So this is 7 years after the legislation that led the Grand Canyon National Park. Really gorgeous work, but again, you can't do anything until you have the proper topographic base map. This was one of the subsequent additions of the Grand Canyon National Park map, but this, unlike his predecessor, was based on aerial surveys. So another takeaway, it's a lot easier when you have remote sensing, right? When you have the aid of technology at your disposal. So hoping to come full circle here in my last 30 seconds, going back to those same USGS maps that Bradford Washburn bemoaned as being insufficient for hiking and scientific purposes. And so Bradford Washburn rectified it with this gorgeous map. But here's the thing, why is this map so cartographically celebrated? Well, it stands on the shoulders of giants. Not only the raw data giants on whom this topographic survey work was built, because actually the in situ, the field-based work that Bradford Washburn performed was actually based on very accurate USGS benchmarks that were already existing, mostly from the Francois-Emile Mat survey. But here's the real crux, and I'm going to go a minute or two over because it's worth it. Here's the real crux. You look at this, there is not only a legacy of rich, robust, building upon, compounding, and improving scientific data, the raw topographic survey data, but also the other side of cartography, which is truly the art or the science and art of making maps. So what do we see here? You might see, yeah, this is beautiful. Let me help you understand why you might think it's beautiful from more of a cartographer's perspective. So we have the more modern, traditional way of representing topography with isometric contour lines. We're very familiar with them, closer together, steep relief, etc. And then there's the more traditional Hatcher marks. I earlier mentioned that Frederick Wilhelm von Eglestein was a cartographic innovator. One of his innovations was that he kind of independently came up with hill shading, creating shadows to imitate the angle of the sun. So what this 1978 Heart of the Grand Canyon map does is take the more modern contour line method, take the more traditional hatcher methods, which look like those that really do a great job of showing relief, combining them right here, contour lines with hatchers, plus the hill shading, then giving it up to the folks at the Swiss Topographic Mapping Agency, doing a fantastically, meticulously gorgeous job. And so you see here, you see the hill shade, you see the hatcher marks, you see the contours, and it's gorgeous. Now, again, this is Francois-Emile Mott's map. Gorgeous, but again, understand, to get here, we first had to get here. Anticlimactic, there. And of course, to get there, we had to first have Joseph Christmas Ives, and we had to have John Wesley Powell, and we had to have this legacy of people standing on the topographic shoulders of giants. Last bit, this is a map produced in the early 20th century by Heinrich Baran, I think. I might be butchering that name. This map is well known. Tom Patterson, recently retired senior cartographer for the National Park Service. He will be speaking at the Mapping Grand Canyon Conference in Tempe, Arizona in 12 days. This map right here is based on raw digital elevation model data, but he took his inspiration from this 20th century map, this fantastic panorama map. This is of Yellowstone, and Baran, I might be butchering that name, did a series of these for multiple places. Many of you are probably familiar with it. But to make good mapping, modern mapping, we still must stand on the topographic and cartographic shoulders of giants. I invite you all to come join us. This is my small spiel. I hope to expand and elaborate on a different angle of this at the historic, unprecedented Mapping Grand Canyon Conference that will be held at Arizona State University in Tempe on February 28th, Thursday, February 28th, and Friday, March 1st. And we have some fantastic speakers, including Dr. Carl Karlstrom, who I think is right there, fantastic, rock star. And most importantly, if you want it, it's free and open to the public. Come on down. If you want to check it out, it's lib.asu.edu/MGCC, as in Mapping Grand Canyon Conference. And of course, I can't help but show off some of my own cartographic work, because I also stand on the cartographic shoulders of giants using modern-day mapping techniques. This is my quick little dabble at doing some of my own Grand Canyon cartography. And that's it. I really appreciate the time. Thanks, everybody.